Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the online research and policy webinars on African development, urbanization, and sustainability, organized by Fondazione Enrico Mattei in collaboration with the Master Design for Development, Architecture, Urban Planning, and Heritage in the Global South, promoted by the Politecnico University of Milan. I'm Enrico, research fellow at FEEM within the research group X, Firms and Cities Towards Sustainability. Today we have Philipp Heinrigs, Senior Economist and Head of Unit at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Good morning, Philipp.
Hello everyone.
We had already the chance to meet Philipp and the work of its unit last September in Milan, when it was easier to organize events in person during one of our workshops. In that occasion, he presented the main features and the methodological approach of the project Africapolis. Today, he will present the Sahel and West Africa Club OECD report, Africa's Urbanization Dynamics 2020, Africapolis, Mapping a New Urban Geography, published in February 2020 and mainly based on the Africapolis project data. But before Philipp's presentation, let me announce you that we have another remarkable guest. Mr. Jeffrey Lagano, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, joined us. Good morning, Mr. Lagano.
Good morning.
We are honored to have you in this webinar, and I'm pleased to leave the floor to you for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Urbanization is the single most important transformation that the African continent will undergo this century in two ways. The pace. There will be 950 million additional urban dwellers by 2050 in African cities. And also the scale. Urbanization is driving important social, economic, and political transformations. This combination of pace and scale make it the single most important transformation. The OECD is supportive of the production of data to inform better policies for better lives. One, the OECD is convinced that know-how can help design evidence-based public policies for economic transformation. The OECD, secondly, is committed to measuring complex phenomena with innovative data, focusing on multi-sectoral interlinkages and engaging in multi-level policy dialogue. Third, the OECD will continue facilitating the design of platforms for cooperation and the dissemination of state-of-the-art research with the goal of advancing the innovative, sustainable, inclusive cities of tomorrow to foster better lives for citizens. Data and evidence help us gain a better understanding of urbanization dynamics. Current day urbanization dynamics in Africa are different from past experiences in OECD countries. Prior to the launch of Africapolis, there was little up-to-date and comparable data available, especially covering the thousands of intermediary cities. Africapolis, produced by the OECD Sahel and West Africa Club, is a major contribution to closing this data gap. The following presentation is based on the Africapolis data and will show the diversity of the African urbanization process and the need to better understand and integrate this transformation to design and implement policies that will help to make cities more inclusive, resilient, and livable. This is tremendous work, and I think particularly in the context of COVID-19, everybody realizes that there will be great challenges in Africa, just not in terms of managing the disease, but in the challenges that relate to food, poverty, the disruptions that's occurred. And certainly here at the OECD, we look forward to working with everybody through the SWAC and other bodies to contribute as best we can to foster better policies for better lives in Africa. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you, Mr. Lagano, for your talk. And now it's up to Philipp Heinrigs. Let me tell you that he will also stop in the middle and at the end of his presentation to answer some questions from the audience. You can ask questions, writing them in the question section. You should see it on the top right of your screen on the main menu. All right, that's it from my side. I leave the floor to Philipp Heinrigs. Philipp, feel free to start whenever you are ready.
Okay, thank you, Enrico. Let me thank you and your colleagues. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, Enrico, thank you very much for hosting this webinar and giving us the opportunity to present this work on Africa's urbanization and the ENI Foundation for organizing it. And thank you all for joining in and showing an interest in this work. As Enrico said, over the next 25 minutes or so, I'm gonna present you some of the main findings of the report we launched at the beginning of this year. And in particular, we will concentrate in this presentation on some of the more surprising aspects of Africa's urban transition currently underway. So to start off with, it's actually coming back to what the DSG Schlagenhoff just said. So urbanization is the single most important transformation the African continent will undergo this century. And it's indeed the combination of this sheer pace and the scale of what this urban transition implies. It changes the social, the economic, and the political structure of the continent countries. The key messages of this work, we believe, are indeed, it is an important feature. It has to be integrated prominently in all development policies across the country, across domains, across ministries. A second important message is Africa is already urban. And this urban Africa, it's very diverse in its manifestations and in its drivers. And it is important to understand this diversity, to be able to define the necessary and adapted policies to accompany this transition. And importantly, we believe it is also an opportunity to shape Africa's urban future. Of course, such a transition implies challenges and problems, but we see it also as a huge opportunity for Africans to shape its future. Let me start off with showing or highlighting a bit the features of the Africapolis database and what it helps us to do by asking about what you think are the largest urban areas in Africa. Most of you will know 3 of them. Many will have heard about Lagos, Cairo, and Kinshasa. But actually the 3rd biggest urban agglomeration in Africa is Onitsha. And Onitsha has 8.5 million inhabitants and is in the continent's biggest economy in Nigeria. You see it on the slide, it's in the Niger Delta area of Nigeria. So how come so few people have heard about Onitsha? And we have 2 possible explanations for this. The first one, it's the pace of the transition. And indeed, would you have had this ranking only 25 years ago, as at the beginning of this animated bar chart in 1990, Onitsha would not have featured in this ranking. Only 25 years later, it is the 3rd biggest. So this pace of transformation that the African continent is witnessing is massive. The second possible explanation we have why we have not heard about Onitsha, or many people have not heard about Onitsha yet, is it also depends on how you define urban. And the starting point for this is that globally, as in Africa, there's no accepted or standard definition what is urban or what is a city. So in each country, governments define a city or urban based on a variety of administrative, functional, and managing criteria. And this example on the map, you see Maputo, it's the capital of Mozambique. And you see this red built up area in the back, which is the continuously built up agglomeration of Maputo. But administratively speaking, the Cidade de Matola and Cidade de Maputo are two independent, separate cities. In official statistics in Mozambique, but also at the international level, like for instance, the United Nations World Urbanization Prospects, Matola is actually the biggest city officially in Mozambique with 1.5 million inhabitants, and Maputo the second biggest. However, if you base your definition of urban on a built-up area, it's Maputo has, or this agglomeration has 2.6 million inhabitants. Also, what is important to keep in mind is that although definitions vary across countries based on these different numerical or administrative definition functional criteria, they all have something in common. And this one point they have in common is they define precise boundaries for the city itself. However, given the strong growth of urban agglomerations and cities in Africa, these boundaries, official limits of cities are often exceeded rapidly by urbanization dynamics. So the Africapolis data combines two criteria to define what we consider an urban agglomeration. The first criteria is the continuously built up area. So we say an area that is continuously built up with less than 200 meters between buildings is considered as one agglomeration. And these buildings can be for residential purposes, for commercial or industrial purposes. It's also infrastructure that is included in this definition. We then consider it urban if it exceeds 10,000 inhabitants. And then we have it in the Africapolis database. Just a bit of information on how it is actually done in practice is we use satellite imagery to detect built-up area across the African continent. This built-up area is then vectorized if it exceeds 1 kilometer, and then in the second step, we overlay, or our partner overlays this information with census information, census points. And this is actually this overlapping of the census information with the built-up area that is the most time-consuming and most valuable work in this approach that allows us to estimate the population of identified urban agglomerations. So this result of doing this is that in 2015, the Africapolis database collects or lists 7,600 urban agglomerations in 50 African countries, and it provides data points ranging back to 1950. So 1950 to 2015, information at national level in terms of the urban population per country, number of agglomerations, average distance, and then information per individual agglomeration. So what does this database show? So as already mentioned, the first point is that Africa is already urban. And on these slides, you see the transition over time. While in 1950, only a handful of countries had an urbanization level above 20%. In 2015, it's actually 22 countries that have more than 50% of its population living in an urban agglomeration as defined by Africapolis. At the continental level, it's 50% of the total African population. And there are now only 12 countries that have an urbanization level below 30%. So again, often in policy narratives or stories about Africa, we still focus a lot on the rural, on the villages. However, Africa has urbanized and this transition is ongoing. A second map uses the same information but doesn't give the level of urbanization, but shows the growth in the number of urban population. So it's the average annual growth rate. And what you see here is actually that often in the countries that have the lowest level of urbanization, like Niger, like South Sudan, and like Malawi, have actually the fastest growth in the urban population. So even in the countries where the level of urbanization is not yet high, urban growth and therefore urbanization are a key topic to include in the policy making process. And if you look at the legend, so the darker blue colors are above 7% annual growth in the number of urban population over a period of 65 years. At a growth rate of 7% per year, you have a doubling in the population every 10 years. So this underlines a bit the scale of the policy and investment dimension in accompanying urbanization in African countries. You have to plan for doubling every 10 years. So what does this numerical dynamic that I've just highlighted, what does it look like on a map? And it looks like this. You have more cities and you have larger cities. So the number of urban agglomeration went from 600 in 1950 to 7,600 today. And also this is something often forgotten when looking or analyzing Africa's urbanization. We tend to concentrate on the large cities, on the agglomerations we heard of, and then their explosive growth. But we tend to forget that a strong dynamic in the smaller and intermediary cities is also existing, and it's structuring the countries of the continent. Enrico, maybe I can stop here if you like me before I continue. Hello.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, I have a very quick question, and it's about the data collecting for the very first year of observation, like the 50s or the 70s. And I was wondering if they are collected in the same way of the most recent years.
No, very good question. Obviously, in the 50s, 60s, we did not have the satellite imagery, the precise imaging that we have today. What has been done for older periods, so up to the 2000s, is using other cartographic sources like maps having been done by military organizations or aerial photography that also exists, and population counts and censuses that provide this information on urban agglomerations. It's only at the beginning of this century, I would say that with the more widespread accessibility and availability of satellite imagery, that this has been the main information for the detection of where urban agglomerations are.
Okay, thank you. I think we can go on, and I can collect the other question for the end of your presentation.
Okay, excellent.
See you later.
Okay, thank you. So coming back to just the previous slide that showed the loop of the growth and multiplications of urban agglomerations. And what you see on the continental map is you have the blue dots, and these are the agglomerations that emerged after 2000. And only over the past 15 years, the number of agglomerations went from something around 5,100 to 7,600 in 2015. So it is something that has happened currently, this proliferation of urban agglomerations, this rural transformation, and I'm going to come back to this aspect in later slides. You also see a focus on Togo and West Africa, where the number of agglomerations, urban agglomerations with more than 10,000 inhabitants, more than doubled over the past 15 years. And there are two important points I would like to make here. First of all, it is with this urbanization and having more urban agglomerations across the territory, you have the interactions between rural and urban areas increasing. What is often called the rural-urban linkages are intensifying through urbanization. You have more flows of people, of ideas and commodities between these small urban areas emerging across the country and their rural hinterlands. A second point I would like to make is that looking again at the pace of this transformation, a doubling over 15 years in the number of agglomerations. And if you link that back to the regularity of censuses being conducted in African countries, in the best cases every 10 years, unfortunately often in temporally more widely spaced, plus a problem of definitional concepts that do not necessarily account for these changes in the geography, in the urban geography. Many of these agglomerations that continue to emerge are not officially recognized in the statistical apparatus, which also implies that there is limited support from a national level in terms of planning and investment connecting these agglomerations to the urban network and structuring the interactions across the country. And this is again a slide summarizing a bit these ideas. So the main idea here is that everywhere in the world and also in Africa, we have few big cities, but we have many small cities. And it is important then when we talk about urbanization that we look at the entire distribution of the urban network, looking at small and intermediary cities and how they structure urban networks. In this graphic, you have the cutoff point at 300,000 inhabitants and above in blue, and 300,000 to 10,000 inhabitants below. And we have chosen this threshold because this is also the threshold the United Nations World Urbanization Prospect uses for cities that are referenced in their databases. So for the African continent, you're going to find only 222 agglomerations listed in the UN statistics, and these are only 3% of the total agglomerations in Africa. So you have 7,400 for which very little information exists as to their size, their placement, and their evolution. And it's important, especially in the context of the sheer growth that African urban areas and countries will continue to live over the coming decades. These small intermediary agglomerations today will be big agglomerations of tomorrow, and there's a need to integrate in the policy planning processes better these places. So what is happening? So what is driving Africa's urbanization? And one of the main drivers is rural transformations. And this brings me back to the example at the beginning of my presentation of Onitsha, the third biggest agglomeration in Africa with 8.5 million inhabitants. So here you see a zoom and you see this dark blue shape, which is the continuously built up agglomeration of Onitsha. It extends over 100 kilometers north-south. The actual center of Onitsha, the historical center, is in the northwestern part of the agglomeration. And over time, you had a process of rural densification, population growth in rural areas, combined with the population growth in existing urban agglomerations, which has led to a merging of this entire area. So what you have here is actually urbanization, rural transformation happening because of an absence of rural exodus, of rural outmigration. What you see when you zoom into a Google Earth or any other satellite images, you can also see there's still a strong diversity in terms of realities and context. So the center of Onitsha and the other more ancient urban settlements in this area, you see the density with very little green places. However, if you go a bit outwards or into the middle of this area, you still see farms being next to more industrial and commercial buildings. So you have this process of transforming areas where the difference between what is rural and urban is blurring in a sense. However, the average density across this whole agglomeration is 3,000 inhabitants per square kilometer, which is more or less 60–70% higher than, for instance, the Milan metropolitan area or the New York metropolitan area. So already the average density is relatively high, and this process is likely to continue over time. So what it also it tells us is, giving this large area with this huge population and the process of continuing densification, what is the administrative setup? What are the administrative layers that are necessary to effectively manage these urban agglomerations? How to plan for public transport, for waste management? What are the scales of coordination that are necessary to make this process, to accompany this process from the policy side more efficiently? This is another example of this rural transformation that is ongoing, and this is at the border between Kenya and Uganda. It's Busia. And what you see here, again, you can well identify the denser historical settlements, and then towards the outskirts, you have a settlement that is following the roads and the ridges of the mountains around it, which highlights an adaptation to the environment and to their livelihoods that is very rational in terms of combining farming activities with interactions with the markets, town, and the border area further north of the settlement. And again, the issue that is here is what is the future in terms of policy planning for these areas? How to provide public services at an efficient scale, at an economic scale? How to accompany this transformation based on the realities of people's life? So this is something that has to be better integrated beyond the purely administrative definition of a city, and everything that's outside of the city is rural and depends on a different administrative environment. Again, it's the importance of linking the urban with the rural, about the territorial approach, about the reality on the ground. These processes of rural transformations that are widespread, they are more dominant in areas with higher population density. So these would be the Ethiopian highlands, the Great Lake areas, and the Nigeria Delta area. You also have increasing tensions or pressures between the environment, between national parks and population that have to be managed. So here you have an image of Mount Kenya in the center, and around it the colored shapes are the built-up areas of settlements around it. And you see the well-defined boundaries of the national park, and then how towards the further downward slopes, how it continues to build up. So you see again this contrast between local reality in terms of very fertile land, in terms of benefiting from tourism activities, which leads to population growth and therefore densification, but at the same time to need to protect natural environments. And this is an example for these increasing tensions or pressures that have to be managed in Africa. And that again highlights a need to combine the different levels of urban planning and urbanization. So you have the local level with local rationals, but then there's also the national interest, and as well in terms of environment, global interests that have to be managed at the right scale. Something we have called a shifting urban geography is the emergence of Africa's urban interior. So this map shows you the color of the urban agglomerations reflects the altitude above sea level. And what you see is actually that a lot of Africa's urban agglomeration are inland. They are not coastal. Of course, many of the cities we know of, people know of widely across the world, again, Lagos, Accra, Abidjan, Cape Town, Tunis, are places that are on the coast And if you only look at the biggest agglomeration, you will have a larger share of the urban agglomerations based on the coast. But looking again at the entire urban distribution, including intermediary and small places, you see that Africa's urbanization dynamic is notably driven inland. Again, it brings me back to the areas with the higher population densities, where this rural transformation process is more pronounced, where you have the emergence of larger urban agglomerations and this densification happening. But what it also shows us is that our view of Africa is biased by the data we use to inform our policies. And here, one of the conclusions is that thinking about the African continental integration and connecting Africa within each other, we have to think about urban networks, using the existing urban networks as connecting points for connecting the continent. Of course, border cities are one of the straightforward entry points for such a connection, and there are around 600 in Africa with a total combined population of 42 million people that you see on this map that can be used for thinking about African continental integration beyond the coastal cities, including these new dynamics. Beyond these new dynamics in terms of connecting, the emergence of Africa's urban agglomeration in the interior also highlights other stakes in terms often of resource allocation and investment priorities. So far, a lot of the urban investments in particular go to the biggest cities with very little left for everything that comes after. So again, this is something that African governments and partners have increasingly to take into consideration, that there's more than just a few big cities driving Africa's urbanization. So some concluding remarks before opening for questions is the transition, Africa's urban transition is so profound with so many dimensions to it that it has to be included in all national policies. It's not just talking about urban planning or urban policies, it is also talking about commerce, about integration, continental integration, it's talking about environment, it's talking about rural-urban linkages. It is a major topic. Also, we believe that there's a need for more and better data highlighting and capturing the urban realities and what is happening on the ground in Africa. Many of these processes are different to what OECD countries have lived in the past in terms of urbanization. And this reality, this emerging urban reality necessitates also a rethinking and adaptation of policies and frameworks. And it is also this adaptation of policies and frameworks where the opportunity for Africa to shape its urban future lies. There are many contexts specific to Africa and many solutions and policies that Africans can develop to manage its urbanization dynamic. A last slide is all the data used and presented in this presentation is freely accessible and downloadable on africapolis.org, and the report where some of its main stories and recommendations or conclusions I have summarized in this presentation is also online on the OECD website, and you can read it and download there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philipp. We have at the moment 4 questions from the audience. I start with the first one. In West Africa, your data shows the emergence of a transnational urban corridor between Lagos and Abidjan. What kind of challenges do you see this raising for governing African urbanization?
Enrico, do you want me to answer after each question, or?
Yes, it's okay. They are kind of different questions.
Okay, excellent. Yes. the greater Ibadan, Lagos, Accra urban corridor, as it is often referred to. For us, this urban corridor along the Gulf of Guinea highlights two processes. And in a more from a more analytical perspective, you see this connection, this densification of these coastal areas in these West African countries, which is interesting to take into account from a national perspective in terms of the balancing urban national networks, how you articulate this strong concentration on coastal areas. It's not just on the coast, but it's like reaching 50 kilometers inwards, and how you manage this process in relation with the rest of the territory. A second important issue refers to the administrative and policy environment of planning and managing this huge urban corridor emergence. So it's at the national level, it's across different administrative authorities, and here it's completely further complexified that you talk about different countries. So you have to find processes and administrative solutions of managing what is more regional at the more regional level, and coordinating the more local initiatives. Of course, there are also other issues in terms of environmental littoral protections, but also in terms of resilience to environmental damage, such as sea level rise, that has to be looked at in this particular case.
Okay, thank you. Now I merge two similar questions. What are the main factors driving the growing urbanization? For instance, climate change, economic development, population growth? And then what might be driving the trend of inland urbanization in particular?
Okay. Indeed, that's a very good question, a very interesting question. At the macro level, there are two main drivers of urbanization. The first one is the population growth. So natural population of existing cities is one of the main drivers in the context of cities that already exist. And the second important driver is this rural transformation or rural classification. This rural transformation has two components. One is simply where you have an existing village that over time grows above a certain threshold, in the case of Africapolis above 10,000 inhabitants, and then we include it in the urban database. Or you have these more morphological processes in terms of densification and connecting of more scattered settlements in a broader context. This is nothing that is particular to Africa. Rural classification, for instance, is estimated to have contributed to 30% of China's urbanization growth in the 70s and 80s. So you also had these processes happening in other countries of the world. Then again, if you look at the more local level, which is very important in understanding urbanization, you can have very different drivers for urbanization. In certain contexts, it can be changes in climate. In other contexts, it can be conflict or human insecurity, which drives people to move into cities to look for shelter. It can be economic, like the opening of a mine or connection to a railway line. So in terms of case by case, it very much depends. At the macro level, it is the population growth, natural growth of cities, and rural reclassification. The rural migration plays a much less prominent role than it is often attributed.
Okay, thanks. Other two similar questions. Does your data therefore suggest migration is no longer driving African urbanization? And then, What is the expected impact of this urban transition, and urbanization on population growth?
Okay, thank you. Yes, again, at the macro level, the migration is not playing an important part. In particular, it has to be nuanced again if we talk just about rural to urban migration or total migration, like also what we see much more happening in current day Africa is that you have, for instance, a migration from rural areas to small and intermediary cities or to neighboring cities, and then from small and intermediary cities to the larger cities. And you also have a process of more circular patterns emerging, notably in larger metropolitan areas like Dakar and Lomé, Cotonou, Abidjan. We also start seeing a migration that is happening from the city centers towards the surrounding, the larger metropolitan area. So rents and living costs in city centers become too expensive, or access to employment is complicated because industrial parks are opening on the outskirts, so people move to the outside. What we also see is that in terms of migration is that people move to a metropolitan area, not necessarily inside the urban agglomeration, which leads to this densification across larger cities. Again, some coastal areas are good illustration for that. This being said, in some countries and cases, migration contributes significantly to urbanization. In the current examples, the most examples that come to mind are related to insecurity and conflict that leads to stronger migration patterns. What is the impact of urbanization on demographic dynamics? What we can already see in the data is that on average for the same country, households in urban areas have significantly less children than in rural environments. And there are several processes that are happening and that explain this acceleration of a demographic transition with urbanization. Is first of all, space is more limited, so paying for lodging for more people becomes more expensive, more problematic, and at the same time, less people are engaged in agriculture, so you also need less people contributing to these economic activities, reducing a need for having more children. And at the same time, urbanization offers also more contact and easier access to education, to new ideas, to health facilities that also show or also have shown to reduce significantly fertility rates. So we believe that urbanization is going to lead to an acceleration and the decline of demographic growth.
Okay. We have 4 more questions. Is it okay for you?
Yes, I'm happy, of course.
Okay. One about informal economy. What role does the informal economy have in shaping rapidly growing cities? And how can informal actors and activities be included in urban development projects?
Okay, thank you very much. The topic of informal activities and informal more widely is really relevant to what Africapolis data also allows us to do. Often, everything that is, for instance, in terms of urbanization, the build-up areas that are outside the official parameter of what is defined the city or the urban area is considered to be an informal settlement. We in Africapolis and in the report prefer to use the term spontaneous settlement to highlight that this is something that is happening because there's also an absence of policy planning that caters to this growth that is happening and these processes we are seeing. So that means that today, in terms of the setup of a city, most cities would have what you call a formal component, the city proper, but which is physically linked to what is more often called the informal settlement. So we believe that, again, this morphological approach that Africapolis uses, the continuously built up area that reflects more of people's realities, is actually more useful in terms of urban planning. So combining the spontaneous or informal settlements to the formal settlements. In terms of economic activities, we know that in most countries in Africa, the urban economy is heavily an informal economy. Again, this is the reality of African cities, and this is the adaptation to, is also an adaptation of people and livelihoods to the processes of the urban transition. We think, again, since it's the reality, policy has to integrate it and include it in the policy making. And we have not looked yet on how to include it, but existing work on informal economies, informal stakeholders show you have to start by recognizing the importance of informal activities, informal actors in contributing to the urban economy, to the urban life. You have to help these actors to get organized and to have a say in urban policy processes. The more widely used examples is, for instance, waste collectors in urban areas. They are all informal, but they contribute to an important function of, so to say, managing urban areas, waste collection, and these aspects. So we believe being able to integrate and include informal activities in programming and planning is key for many urban agglomerations over the next couple of decades.
Okay, thanks. Now, other two questions together. The first one is, what are the main differences between West and East Africa urbanization patterns, if there are some, and are some regional, district, local authorities in Africa already using the Africapolis data?
Okay, thank you. The differences in terms, it's often the differences between urbanization processes are informed by environmental, historical, and political context. So it's not so often the region as such, but you will see that, for instance, in dry areas like in the Sahel that stretches across the continent, population and settlement patterns are more similar. It's a more grouped settlement, less sprawl and dispersed settlements. In more forest areas and hill areas, you have a more dispersed settlement, which reflects more the agricultural livelihoods of societies. In terms of policies, again, this is a very interesting question, and we plan to go more into these aspects to see how different policy systems lead to different policy outcomes, and how there can be joint knowledge sharing and experience, peer learning, so to say, among African countries. But we see that some countries are more advanced in planning for urban growth and urban expansion, like Tanzania, for instance, than others. But I have difficulties finding a more broader difference between West and East Africa in terms of the patterns we observe. In terms of using the Africapolis data, so the Africapolis, the approach or the methodology of Africapolis is, it's actually already used by certain countries, for instance, France and Sweden. And in Africa, Algeria is using a definition to define an urban agglomeration that's very similar in terms of the continuously built up area. And I think the numerical threshold is 2,000 inhabitants, but I'm not sure about that. So certain countries have approaches that use this type of or have methodologies in place that use this type of information but it's nothing widespread. What we think it's important is to also use this kind of definition to inform national policy making. Of course, at a more local level, you need administrative boundaries to define responsibilities and to define, so to say, how to manage. But Africapolis and similar approaches, we believe, are necessary to inform more on the more structural processes that are ongoing. We have started contacting colleagues at African institutions, notably the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, to see in how far the Africapolis approach can be useful to start in exchanges on data, methods, and capacities in Africa on urbanization. So we hope that Africapolis and similar approaches will be more widely used and informed by African countries in the future.
Okay. Then, what are, in your opinion, the main urban sustainability challenges in Africa's cities?
I think, again, it's very different. What you have for me at the moment, a challenge is to combine sustainability thinking with the need to plan and welcome a huge population growth in the coming decades. So in certain contexts, this is going to be easier than in others. But it has to be this combination between sustainability, at the same time, the need to provide services and housing accessibility to an increasing number of urban residents. What I find particularly interesting looking and reading about urbanization in Africa is in how much what we see in Africa can give rise to new approaches in terms of urban management and urban planning. Are there ways of combining these densifying areas with some more urban aspects? In certain ways, what we have said is that in Europe or in more Western cities, we are currently in a process where we are thinking about bringing more rural aspects back into urban life, like parks and urban agriculture. We believe in Africa, it's actually inverse that is happening at the moment. We have to think of getting more urban aspects into a more rural environment, and how this can be combined with more local approaches and sustainable approaches is something very interesting for the future.
Okay, I told you that there were the last 4 questions. We have indeed many questions, but I think that we can answer to other 2 questions, and if you are available, the audience can write you by mail if you are okay.
Of course, happy. Please do so. Happy to.
We have 2 very long questions. I try to sum up. The first one is about the link between foreign investment, Chinese, European, or US investment, and the pattern of the development of cities, if there is a link. And the second one is more specific and is related to the Maputo metropolitan area. And she asks, what kind of tools can be imagined for governing and planning such unrecognized agglomerations?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the question of investments is crucial. So talking about planning, you necessarily talk about investments into public services and infrastructure. Again, as mentioned in the introduction, current scenarios say that over the coming 30 years, 950 million additional urban dwellers in Africa. and you combine that with a current backlog in urban investment needs, makes for enormous investment needs in Africa's urban areas. You have, obviously, you have a lot of private investors that are looking into the opportunities existing, and you have more state-to-state partnerships. Often the Chinese are mentioned in terms of urban investments. I believe, and this is without much in-depth knowledge of the processes, I think it's there has to be, these investments have to be informed by what is needed, and how it answers to particular contexts. Because often, or what you see, I think Angola and Mozambique are good examples for that. You see these new purpose-built satellite cities emerging on the peripheries, built to Chinese models that will be home to 30,000 people. It provides housing, but then the second question is, how does it relate to planning in terms of accessibility to employment opportunities? How is it going to link to educational opportunities? Is that so? There needs to be a more coherent planning across these public services that and infrastructures that are needed, and this has to be driven. This has to be driven and owned by local populations. That has to be informed by local governments and stakeholders, and has to be coordinated also at more national level. But we see many examples of these investments that do not necessarily respect this need for thinking a bit more broadly about connections between certain investments and existing urban agglomerations. So there's definitely scope for improvement along this one. In terms of the tools and frameworks on how to improve administrative capacities or administrative setup for these urban agglomerations, there's ongoing work at the OECD and collaboration at the European level about functional urban areas, how these can be, how you can simplify administrative layers across functional urban areas that are more respective or more influence on mobility patterns, commuting patterns in these areas. So there is work that is ongoing and that can also be used to inform strategies in Africa.
Okay. Well, thank you, Philipp, for your presentation, for your answers, and for having accepted our invitation. I would like to thank again Mr. I would like to thank again Mr. Lagano for his participation. And finally, let me thank my colleagues and the FEEM staff for the help in the organization of this event. And see you in September with the third date of our research and policy webinars on African development, urbanization, and sustainability, when we will talk about urban sustainability. You can visit our website and our social accounts, Twitter and Facebook, to stay up to date with all our events. Thank you for watching and have a nice weekend.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you.